Welcome to plenary session 4, Cognitive and Consciousness Enhancement Technology. We have two very interesting, exciting speakers on two different areas of enhancing cognition and consciousness. And I'm very pleased to introduce the first speaker, Pattie Maes, who is from the MIT Media Lab. She went there from Belgium originally to work with Marvin Minsky and Rodney Brooks on robotics and AI, and has moved into intelligence and cognition augmentation and the effort to build intelligent machines. So let's give a nice warm welcome to Pattie Maes.
Good morning. I'm interested in our relationship with our devices and how the devices that are now so ubiquitous are affecting our minds. As you all know, these days, at least in the Western world, a child gets a cell phone at the age of 12 or 13, and forever after, they're inseparable from their device and consulted hundreds and hundreds of times a day. The younger generation doesn't even part with their phones at night, and 50% of them check their phone in the middle of the night. Of course, these devices do have some benefits. They give us access to the world's knowledge and information, but I would argue that they don't really help us become better versions of ourselves. They do not really help us with things like mindfulness, changing bad habits and behaviors we may have, attention, memory, regulating our emotions, making us become more creative, and so on. To the contrary, current technology, current cell phones have a detrimental effect. Now that we have these devices in over 2.2 billion hands, studies are coming out every week that show the negative effects on physical, cognitive, emotional, and social well-being. Just the presence of a phone on a table makes people perform less well on certain tasks. People relate less to other people when a phone is present on the table, and so on and so on. Study after study is coming out, but I don't think we'll ever convince, especially the younger generation, to give up these devices. The cat is out of the bag, or whatever the expression is, and we're not going to get it back in. Now, I think the problem with today's devices is the way they are designed. If you make an analogy with technologies for enhancing vision, originally we had things like monocles, and you had to take the monocle out of your pocket if you needed to see something better, and maybe you even had different lenses to see things far away or up close, etc. But of course, today, most people just opt for contact lenses, which you can put in once and then leave in for a month, and you forget that they are there, but they improve your vision and are sort of seamless, a seamless type of technology that is not disrupting your daily activity. With cell phones and smartphones, we're still in the monocle stage. They require that you completely shift your attention. I have to find my phone in my bag and unlock it and then start an app and type in a keyword, etc., if I want to look up something that is relevant to whatever it is that I'm currently doing. So in my group, I've always been interested in thinking how we can, or what the device of tomorrow could be like. What will the personal device of tomorrow be? A device that hopefully is a lot more seamless in its use, less disruptive in its use, and does not require an attention shift. So we have been designing and experimenting with new systems in my group, which we call cognitive enhancement systems. They are devices that basically modify a person's environment in order to affect their thinking and behavior in a direction that they want to change it in. These wearable cognitive systems unlike today's cell phones, are always on. They are much more aware of a user's internal and external state. They can alter the user's perception of their environment by adding stimuli that are multimodal, as well as some of them are conscious and some of them are unconscious, in that the user is not even aware that their vision or their auditory environment or olfactory environment is being modified by the technology. And we do this, we change the person's perception of their reality in order to affect their decisions and their behavior. And I'll give a bunch of examples in a minute to make that a little bit more concrete. Now, I think that the time is right to sort of design these totally new types of devices that we will carry and wear all the time, and that hopefully support us in more positive ways. The time is right because a lot of enabling technologies are now available. Things like sensory augmentation technologies, visual augmentation with augmented reality glasses like in the upper right, auditory augmented reality or auditory modification of a person's reality with things like the Bose earphones that can in real time change what you hear and let you focus on a speaker while reducing the noise in the background, things like that. Olfactory devices like the one that we have been building in our lab, Essence, that can modify the olfactory environment of a person in real time based on the situation. Tangible devices that use heat, that use haptics, etc. A second enabler is sensor technologies that can make these systems more aware of the user's current state, both their external context, what is around them, where they are, who they are with, what they are doing, as well as their internal state. Are they anxious? Are they a little bit sleepy? Are they nervous right now, etc.? There's now technologies available cheaply and in very convenient form factors that give you EEG, for example, in the form of sunglasses, sensors that can sense your heart rate variability, your electrodermal activity, which is a sense of how excited you are right now. Mine would be high, I'm sure, right now. Temperature, etc. And there's also wearable cameras available that in real time can analyze what is going on in and around a person's environment. They can know that you are giving a talk to a group of people. They can know that you are that you're having a conversation with someone, that that person is frowning or smiling, etc., that you're inside, outside, and so on, that you're about to reach for the third donut. These systems are now available and can operate in real time to then maybe influence your decision-making in the moment. The third enabler is artificial intelligence technology. We make a lot of use of deep neural networks in our work to model users and to decide how to influence the user in the current moment. And the fourth enabler of our work is insights from neuroscience and from psychology that we make use of to design systems that exploit some of these insights into how human thinking works, how human behavior works, so that we can use those again to affect users. So my group at the Media Lab builds wearable platforms for cognitive enhancement and also performs experiments to show what these things can do. Today's talk will be more focused on the application areas, but we have a whole range of platforms which we are trying to make available to the community so that other people can use our devices to experiment with this new way of thinking. Now, I'll give you examples in the rest of the talk of how we have used cognitive and built cognitive enhancement systems in my lab that can support memory, learning, creativity, awareness and attention, decision-making and behavior change, as well as emotion regulation. Take memory. We're not actually doing that, but maybe someday. Maybe that's what the next speaker will talk about. But we are supporting human memory with these wearable devices that we are building. And here's one experiment that we did. My students Oscar Rosello and Mark Esposito used augmented reality technology to make it easier for people to learn a set of facts, unrelated facts that are hard to learn. And we are making use of one of the insights from neuroscience, the fact that episodic memory and spatial memory is sort of easier. It's easier to encode things in spatial memory than it is in factual memory. So we make use of the memory palace technique to enable a person to learn a set of facts by tying them to locations that they are very familiar with using the augmented reality glasses. We took it as our example task learning the Super Bowl winners, something that MIT students aren't typically all that interested in. So that was a good choice. And what we did is we basically used the glasses on the left to visualize the subsequent winners, the winners each year of the Super Bowl in the person's real environment. So we took a route that many students at MIT are familiar with from the subway station, the Kendall Square subway station near MIT, to the Media Lab office, their Media Lab office. And we present pictures in their superimposed on their reality, their visual reality, of these subsequent Super Bowl winners. So you come out of the subway and you see the picture in the top left of a guy with a lot of boxes, which reminds you that the first year the Green Bay Packers won the Super Bowl. Then you go up the escalator and you again see a guy with a lot of boxes, again the Green Bay Packers. You come out of the subway station and there's a jet parked right there at the entrance to the subway station for the New York Jets. You go up the steps of the medical building and you see a chief sitting there on the stairs. You go inside the medical building and two guys are fighting with Colts, the Baltimore Colts. You go up the stairs of the Media Lab and you see a cowboy on his horse for the Dallas Cowboys, etc. Here's a little video of what that looks like. So you just wear a pair of glasses that can superimpose things like the dolphins, the panthers, etc. in your visual field. And what is amazing is that we tested this technology, and you only have to experience this once to remember this sequence of Super Bowl winners for a very long time. In fact, it took me personally at least 20 years of living in this country to know that the Super Bowl was football. And I can still tell you what the 10 first Super Bowl winners are, because I experienced them, and they are forever linked to this path from the subway station to the Media Lab. We also tested this with in a more formal, quantitative way, had people study all the Super Bowl winners on paper, other people use the device. And the people who study on paper, right after studying, they actually know it equally well. But already 24 hours later, they've forgotten more than 50% of the Super Bowl winners. And 7 days later, it's almost 2/3, etc. While the people that used our system, the Nevermind augmented reality system, basically do not, their knowledge does not degrade. We're doing other experiments with memory augmentation. One of my students is basically recording his entire life with a video, wide-angle video, audio. There's a physiological recording of his heart rate, his electrodermal activity, etc. And he's now adding EEG as well. And he's analyzing all this data with the amazing APIs that are now available from Google and other places for analyzing video, for analyzing sound. The system can tell you when there's a dog barking, when there was laughter, etc. And we collect all of that data along all of these different modalities and can then and like I said, it's totally annotated. This is actually the software that we use, YOLO, which is a neural net that has been trained to, it can run in real time, and it gets some things wrong, but for consecutive images, that error reduces, but it can recognize everything around a person, a knife, a bowl, pizza, a chair, etc. And NEO is basically studying memory, the relationship of memory to physiological data, such as electrodermal activity, heart rate, etc., to study what kinds of memories people form, or which things are more memorable than other things, and does it correlate, for example, to certain EEG data or to EDA data and so on. He's especially motivated to help people with Alzheimer's and dementia who could actually wear a device like this and then maybe revisit previous memories to sort of rehearse their memories and keep them alive. In fact, we can, by tagging all these memories and relating them to one another, we can give you little sort of summaries of, like, here's a lot of interactions with your daughter, here's a lot of interactions in your neighborhood, etc. And we are also using this data to, in real time, help people with memory assistance. Those of you over the age of 50 in the audience, I'm sure have all experienced this situation many times where you may say, like, you forget a person's name and it's actually one of your best friends, possibly. And this type of system can actually use the camera, the onboard camera, to remind you, if you need a reminder of who someone is who's coming towards you, what you last talked about with that person, when you last saw them, etc. Supporting learning. One of my students is using these wearable types of technologies to see how they will change learning, especially language learning or learning of a second language. So he's been using augmented reality systems that constantly tell you the names of the objects in the language that you're learning, in this case English, plastic bottle, computer, mouse, etc., so that you sort of automatically pick up this second language because it's always there in your perception and your experience of reality. He has gone further with that work and shown that if you learn words, action words, while you perform them, like drink, pour, etc., you actually remember these words in a second language a lot better than when you learn them from a video, from a book, etc. Because you have a kinesthetic way of learning them, and your movement almost becomes like a pointer or another access point, another cue that can help you and can prime your memory to remember the words for drink and the word for pour, etc. So again, we did quantitative tests that show that this kind of kinesthetic learning of action words in a second language is a lot more sticky. We had people who learned it on paper, people who learned it in VR by seeing the movement, but they didn't engage in the movement themselves. And then we had in the middle the people who basically learned in a kinesthetic way. They heard the words and saw the words when they performed the action. And again, their loss of words over time is a lot smaller than that of the other two groups, because they have this full body or this embodied way of learning, which is a lot more effective. We've also been working on supporting creativity, and this is the work of Adam, who's sitting here in the front, if you want to talk to him later. So Adam is very interested in accessing dreams, and specifically lucid dreaming that can happen in hypnagogia. So this is actually a technique that has been used for, again, many hundreds or more years by people like Tesla and Edison and Dali and so on. They all use this technique of letting themselves sort of drift off into sleep while holding like a steel ball or something heavy, which would drop to the floor at the moment that they sort of enter sleep. And at that moment, your mind is basically a lot less logical and is sort of better at doing creative thinking and less rational thinking. So we made that technique easier by building a system called Dormio that uses EEG as well as a hand sensor to sense when a person is entering that hypnagogic sleep state. And at that moment, we have either a robot or we also have a cell phone version, starts talking to you and tells you what to dream about. And what we have shown in our experiments so far with about 15 subjects is that all of the experiments, all of these subjects end up dreaming about the word that the robot gives them to dream about. So you can basically do inception of that sort of semi-lucid dreaming state. And actually, Professor Barrett of Harvard Medical talks about this hypnagogic state as being sort of a time when the prefrontal areas of the brain are less active. And because of that, there's less censorship from the mind over the ideas that your brain is producing. And so this more allows or enables a more free flowing of sort of ideas that may be a little bit more creative or a little bit more out there. So it results in more flexibility. On the left, there's actually some quotes from some of our subjects who also noted that their ideas sort of were like more creative, and they seem to be flowing right through them, etc. So they report sort of being in this less inhibited state where things just come at them. So with this system, you can basically use this technology to do this more creative thinking about a problem that you may be thinking about. We also quantitatively studied this system and had subjects, some subjects would just rest without falling asleep, other subjects would use our Dormio system and be like woken up by the robot at the right moment and asked to talk about a particular topic. And the robot, by the way, records everything you talk about so that it doesn't only make it easy to sort of do this inception of dreams, but also the recording of the thoughts and so on that you have. And we did a study, you can get the details in the paper or from Adam here, that showed that people do indeed come up with more creative ideas. We used the alternative users task, which is a typical task that is used to test creativity, as well as a storytelling task, and had independent third parties evaluate all of the products or what all of our subjects in the control and experimental condition came up with. A lot of our work is also about supporting decision-making and behavior change. All of us want to change some or other behavior, but it's really hard because a lot of our behavior, day-to-day behavior is not very mindful, is actually very automatic, emotional, and not really based on sort of rational thinking. So we've been using, again, augmented reality systems to help people with behavior change. Sometimes it's as simple as just noticing what a person is staring at, and if the system knows that person wants to avoid sugar, it can actually give you this little reminder, or to tell you, or to just bring you to your more conscious, rational thinking, so that in that moment you think you can at least sort of for a moment reflect and think, do I really need this Coke, or should I go with something more healthy? We could do other things as well. For example, with the olfactory systems that we've built, we could actually have a more subtle stimulus that you may not even be that aware of, where every time you're in front of a Coca-Cola bottle, you smell something bad, and thereby pairing sort of Coca-Cola with a bad smell and affecting your future behavior. Another project in the decision-making area that we've been working on is a system for silent speech interfacing, and in fact, we just sort of made this public a week ago. Basically, as many of the linguists here in the audience will know, you can sort of silently speak words, and you do that, for example, when you're reading, especially beginner readers silently voice words when they read them. Speed readers can actually get beyond that and don't necessarily have to voice every word that they read, and thereby can read more fast. But what we did is we built a system called Alter Ego, which picks up the silence, the subvocalization that you can deliberately do to talk to a device or another person across the room. We analyzed what signals you produce when you subvocalize, and we built and we analyzed the musculatory system, etc., and built a system with 7 electrodes. It looks a little scary, but we actually have the real system down to 4 electrodes now. And you can voice words internally. The person is actually internally speaking to their device right now. We trained a neural network to categorize these words so that you can silently speak to your computer, and through bone conduction headphones, the computer can talk back to you. So this basically enables all sorts of applications. You can have math superpower. So here the user is silently speaking to the device what sum or what arithmetic he wants the device to do. And then the system responds with the bone conduction headphones. Sorry, the sound is off, but normally the person hears the answer spoken to them. Again, here the person is telling the system what moves are being made, and then the system can reply back and give suggestions for moves to make. You can silently turn off the lights in your room. You could silently speak to another person in a meeting, etc. So we think this is very interesting because there is so much talk in the news about how AI will take over our jobs and so on, but we think it's a lot more interesting to see how people and devices can work together, basically, or people and AI technology can work together to be super intelligent, or, as opposed to sort of competing with these machines. Again, we've experimented or looked at the results, and we get about 93% accuracy of the system, and yeah, so we think that has a lot of promise. We work a lot on emotion regulation as well. One very interesting project was one where we give people false feedback about their own data, their own breathing, basically. It turns out that, and other people have done this as well with heart rate, if you change a person's perception of their own heart rate or their own breathing, you give them a perception of slower breathing than their actual breathing, you can actually affect how anxious they feel. So Xin Liu in my group, who did this work, built a system where she records the breathing and can play it back at a slightly lower rate. She gave people a GRE test and a very limited amount of time to complete that test. And the people who hear their own breathing in a calmer way actually perform or show less anxiety during that task than the people who hear their actual breathing. Judith, who's sitting in the front here, has been doing a lot of work related to olfactory interfaces. Olfactory interfaces, or the olfactory sense, is really neglected in today's human-computer interaction, but the literature from psychology and neuroscience is extremely interesting about how scent can be used to alter behavior, to change mood, to help people learn, etc. So Judith has been working or has designed a device that can be controlled based on your physiological data, EEG data, your heart rate, EDA, etc., information about what it is that you're currently doing, so that the system, for example, can wake you up if you're behind the wheel and you're a little bit drowsy with peppermint smell, or it can calm you down with vanilla or lavender when you are experiencing pain, or when you want to be, say, less anxious, and so on. We now have a version of the system with multiple containers for releasing multiple types of scent. And the whole thing can be controlled with an app on the phone, where you tell the system how you want your behavior changed, basically, based on this release of these just-in-time scents. Again, Judith has been doing studies to evaluate the effect of the olfactory interfaces, for example, on a relaxation task, and again, using both physiological measures as well as subjective reporting of relaxation. And people who use the device basically both report, and based on their data, their relaxation levels are better. So in summary, I would like to conclude that I think it's unavoidable. We are merging with our devices. We made that choice unknowingly about 10 years ago or so, when smartphones were developed. And I don't think we're ever going to go back. However, I think that the relationship with our devices does not need to be a negative one, and does not need to have a negative impact on our cognition, on our lives. I think it just requires being a little bit more creative to think of a very different type of relationship, where the devices can actually help us with our personal goals, help us with the learning we want to do, the behavior change we want to do, how we want to be better in control of our emotions, teaching us how to be more creative, how to learn more effectively, and so on. Now, of course, we try to keep in mind that our designs should be mindful of some of the possible dangers that exist in sort of merging with these devices and giving us access to our cognition and affecting our cognition. Things like invasion of privacy, lack of user understanding. It's very important that the user understands how everything happens and is in control and can decide how they want their perception changed so as to affect their thinking and their behavior. Dependency is an important thing to think of as well. we want to avoid as much as possible that people become dependent on these things and that they can still operate or learn some of these things themselves. And of course, we want to avoid blinders to the real world when we augment people's reality and people living in bubble worlds. Thank you.
Questions? We have time for some questions.
So there's time for some questions if people come to the microphone. Yep, there's
Hi.
one there.
Very, very nice. The last points, however, they are very important, I think, because I cannot imagine how can somebody not be dependent on these things once it is chronically used. Once it is chronically used, how can one not be dependent on this, the reward and all these things? How do you manage with that? Or even if by chance the batteries are low, at some point can you have a drawback that you have a withdrawal syndrome or something like that? You mentioned the dangers, but how you deal with that?
Yeah. So one way we deal with it is, the first thing is to be very aware of it, basically, and have a lot of conversations during our designs and our research and so on about these potential dangers. As much as possible, we try to, in a way, teach people a little bit about their own mind and about some of these tricks that they could even use without technology to improve their cognition and be able to learn things like kinesthetic learning. Well, you could potentially do kinesthetic learning without technology while you're learning the verbs, say verbs or something in a second language. You could engage in the activities. You don't need to have a virtual reality system that recognizes your movements and so on in order to do so. Same for the sort of system that teaches you a list of facts or helps you remember a list of facts. Once you sort of have experienced this, you can start using that technique in your head without the use of technology. So to the extent that that is possible, we try to promote sort of building systems that let you experience and learn some things about yourself and your own mind that then you can use later. Now, for many types of user bases, though, like the elderly, for example, there may not be a way of improving memory or something. So in those cases, I think it's ethically justified to build a system that they depend on if that means that they can still be more social, less socially isolated, etc., and perform or live their lives at a higher quality.
So, really briefly, not that it's actually new, but yesterday the NIH came out with a new conclusive study that the cell phones are actually breaking down the bonds in the brain and causing tumors and things like that. It was a new study, but it was more conclusive evidence. And so what about all of this stuff with the technology and the interfacing with our brains and cancer and things like that, tumors and stuff that's...
Yeah. I'm not aware of that particular study, but I think that, I'm not an expert particularly in knowing what would be the cause of the cancers, whether it's the radio that actually causes that or some other part of the technology. But I think that there might be ways that you could design around those problems once you understand what the actual cause is. Second, again, as I said, if you talk to younger people, they are not going to give up their technologies. What was the study? Somebody did basically questions a bunch of people, and they would rather clean a bathroom than be without their phone. This was like an actual study. So I think that we are not going to go back, and we're not going to reduce our use and reliance on these technologies. It will only get more and more, so they'll come closer and closer to us and be with us more and more often, and we'll rely on them and basically delegate some aspects of our cognition to these devices. We're already doing that. People like Professor Sparrow at the University of Columbia have shown that people read differently when they read on a screen. They no longer take all the information in the way they read on paper because they know they can go back to it. So they read just scanning it and looking for a summary of what is in the document, as opposed to really trying to internalize what the text says. And they do this unconsciously. So it's already, we are changing our minds, we are changing how we live based on these technologies, and it's not going to change, I think. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. I'm sorry.
Oh, wow, so it has to be a very good question. Let's try. So it's very nice technologies with a good potential, but in the end of the day, big companies like Facebook or Google are companies that just want to make more money. And they have to do it more and more money every year, right? So how can we avoid from the use of these technologies, not in order to make us developed human beings, but better consumers, with more impulsive consumers, let's say. So,
yeah, I think one very big problem with the field of technology right now is the business models. At some point in the past, we moved from paying for software to all these services being free. And now everybody just assumes everything is going to be free, but they don't realize that there is no such thing as free. Free means you're giving up your data. I think we have, and free also means that the companies that make these services are not, their incentives are not aligned with those of the users. They're not trying to do the best thing for the user, they're trying to do the best thing for the marketers and the advertisers. They're maximizing potential advertising revenues. So I am convinced that we have to go back to a model of paying for technology so that technology can be designed with the users and the consumers' interests in mind, not those of the advertisers.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you, Pattie. It's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Stephen Gullans. He is a former academician, an author, an entrepreneur, an investor, and a grandfather. He will speak on Our Future Brains, a story of unnatural selection and non-random mutation. Stephen.
Thank you, Stuart. This is it's a great audience. It's wonderful to be invited to this event because it's so eclectic. It's so enjoyable to see such a broad range of topics and interests. Today I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, but I'll begin by saying Pattie's talk was spectacular. One of the great joys of my life is actually, I live in Boston as well, as walking around the MIT Media Lab and just seeing all the incredible things that are coming together. In fact, every time I'm there, I kind of wish that I could actually read the minds of all the young people to see what the future really is going to look like, because it's very, very much a creative atmosphere with good things going on. I'm going to do two things today. I'm going to give you a view of the future, which is always a challenge. I'm going to also give you a charge at the end of something that's your responsibility, which we'll talk about later. But let's begin by going back 150 years ago. Here's Chuck Darwin. Charles was a medical school dropout, so he didn't follow the footsteps of his father. And that was probably a disappointment. But like his grandfather, he was on a mission to become a Parsons when in 1831 he signed on to the HMS Beagle. He had to pay his own way, but he was a man of means, so he didn't mind doing that. And his life was changed forever. It took him 25 years before he published On the Origin of Species, because his wife had told him he was going to be damned to hell. His family was really upset if he ever wrote this thing, and in fact, he had gone through many, many edits and 20 years of collecting information. And it was only when Wallace actually came up with the same idea that he was pushed forward to do this. And what he generated was what we call Darwinian evolution. It's well accepted in many parts of the world, not all, that it's generated through natural selection and random mutation. Darwin was very clear that these things took a long time because he could see it in the fossil records, he could see it in the things he knew, but he also was very involved in animal breeding, and he actually excluded humans from a lot of his discussions in most cases. This has been a very, very powerful, and over 150 years we're still talking about it. That's an extraordinarily powerful paradigm. It's something we think about all the time. And what I find is most people view in the context of modern humans, in modern human evolution, this is the way things behave. And in fact, it's probably irrelevant to our everyday lives. My good friend Juan Enriquez and I wrote a book called Evolving Ourselves where we talk about this. And the point is that humans, like most species today, grew up in a world that looks like this. It's no longer the world that we live in today. We live in a very unnatural world. And so to say that, in fact, humans are unchanged by the world around us is something that I would posit is probably not true and perhaps even irresponsible. So in fact, what we live in today is a world that is completely filled with unnatural selection because in many ways, we've changed the world to our needs, either purposely or non-purposely, in ways that have actually driven both natural evolution and unnatural evolution, drive through into traits, behaviors, genetic changes, evolutionary catastrophes, as well as extinctions. So our world is completely changed today. We talk about this in most contexts, except human contexts, by and large. I won't go through this at all, except for a couple of quick points, because we're really here to talk about the brain, and this has impacts on the brain, but the details are limited, and some are in the book. Let's do look at a couple of facts. Just in terms of unnatural selection, it's about survival and reproduction. Those are the two basic drivers. For thousands of years, the average lifespan was about 25 years, and then suddenly it exploded to something very, very high. This is certainly very unnatural. In addition, survival at birth, 10% of the babies in this country did not survive early childhood 100 years ago. Now, if we're having someone even in the ICU is a relatively rare event. So we've changed this. And on top of that, in Darwin's day, there was only one way for humans to reproduce. And now there's probably a dozen. So the ability to carry genes forward, to modify our progeny, to modify ourselves in ways that were unfathomable in the natural world are actually driving our natural world, our current world. So our biology is designed for this, but in fact we live in this. Just think about this, the traffic, the noises, lights 18 hours a day, medicines, all of the modern things we do to our bodies. As a point of reference, a single season of drought in the Galapagos leads to 60% of the finches having a different beak because the shells on the seeds that they're eating are changed. That's just a single season of drought in one generation, the next generation of eggs. So to think that humans are unchanged is, in my view, naive. Unfortunately, we don't have the ways of measuring this over long time periods to really generate a record. And in fact, the big databases we're generating today over the next 60 years will reveal many things. So in fact, we have life changing all around us. Imagine these two trying to survive in the savannas of Africa. Probably won't do very well. And something I'm not going to talk about, but is always controversial, is to look at the ways we are changing. And in general, you find great scientists telling you it's about the ways we measure things. It's about all kinds of artifacts in the scientific measurement. But in fact, we're finding ways to live longer, be smarter, but the incidence of allergies, autism, and diabetes are rising. And in every one of these cases, people pointed 100 causes of it, which really means if it was like smoking causes lung cancer, we would have figured it out 50 years ago. These are an amalgamation of things in our environment, things we're changing, and the unnatural world we live in. But I'm going to now turn my attention to something else, our brains. Our brains are changed. Although the Plen effect is controversial, I would argue that in fact humans are actually smarter by and large in modern societies. I have a very joyful life. I actually lived as an academic for 25 years, writing papers, writing grants, and in the late 90s, my cousin got ALS, my father got Parkinson's, and I had a nirvana that said, gee, why don't I try to do something about these things that I researched? So I actually joined a department of neurology at the Brigham, and I started throwing lots of cool toys and tools and methods and drug discovery things at it before translational medicine was on the radar screen. In fact, I was in 60 Minutes saying I was disrupting the way science was being done by the NIH. It's now mainstream to be doing translational medicine, but it didn't get funding before I actually left because I got a little frustrated that pushing discoveries into the hands of everyday people was going to be important. So when we see great things like from Pattie and everybody else, how do we actually get it out in the world? So now I actually live in many, many worlds. Fundamentally, I walk the halls of the MIT Media Lab as an example, but I also am meeting with bankers on Wall Street because I want to actually bridge this gap. And the good news is there are many, many efficient ways to do it. There's a lot of people willing to help and do things about it, to find cheap drugs that are safe and actually more effective. The sad news is the brain has been the hardest place to conquer by far. And there's a limited amount of opportunity here today, but I will talk a little bit about that. So this is a caveat, this is a warning. I'm about to talk about the future, and we all know this phrase. It's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So everything I'm saying is probably going to be off the mark. I always thought this was Yogi Berra, but I had the opportunity to go look online. There's a lot of people who discovered this clever idea a while ago, starting with a Danish politician. But I'm also humbled by the idea that if we look back to 1977, you find Ken Olsen, the founder of digital equipment, predicting there's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. This is merely 2 years after Microsoft was founded, and 1 year after Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded Apple Computer. So to the extent we're all sitting here saying we know what the future looks like, we're wrong, because we're all experts in a domain that's only looking at a few years. And the dynamics of what will impact the everyday lives of people that we know and love is very unclear when we look out 20 or 30 years. One way I like to look at it is through a guy named Roy Amara. He was very insightful about the future. He was actually president of the Institute for the Future. And he talked about we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run. We've seen some great technologies. We just saw some wonderful things from Pattie. And in fact, the idea of augmented reality, the ideas of enhanced brain memorization, cyber humans, these are actually things we hear about in the media every day, so we assume it's tomorrow. We're going to go through this lull period, which I'll talk about right now. And here's the curve that actually the Gartner group pulled together that actually characterizes what Roy Amara said, which when something comes out in the media, we're actually first hearing about it at the peak of inflated expectations. And this is just how things are seen in the world. And then there's disillusionment, because it actually doesn't impact your everyday life. How often do we read about a cure for cancer, and then we ever see it actually realized? And then, so we go through this trough of disillusionment. We actually forget about it. We forget that it ever was going to happen. And there's lots of examples of that. Then there's a slope of enlightenment. In this case, I'm talking not about when something is researched, but at the very, very origin of this graph is the academic research lab or the engineering group. It's in a small garage. And what you're seeing at the end is actually coming into the everyday world. So if we look at the IT technology hype, this is well described. Today we actually carry smartphones and GPS and consumer electronics. 1955, one computer existed, the ENIAC, or 1953. So it's been a long run. It's taken 40, 50, 60 years to actually get to this point. And as you go down this curve, you see what's actually kind of invisible these days. Robots. We have the Roomba, a wonderful characterization. We all thought we were growing up with Rosie the robot and the Jetsons, etc. But in fact, we're in this lull period where there's a robot here, Sophia, who's actually showing us some other aspects of it. Robotics and AI are going to drive an enormous amount of our lives in the not too distant future. Autonomous cars are everywhere. When's the likelihood it's going to show up in your neighborhood? Well, we're probably going to have some trucks on highways before that, and we haven't even seen those yet. Cyberhumans, we're talking about those. You've seen a little bit of that from Pattie, but in a very different way. And so what I'm now going to talk about is the biotech revolution. Using this as an analogy of where we've been and where we're going to, I'm going to make projections based on what we've got going on. So the computer revolution really started right after the war with the ENIAC and the computers that came out in the 50s. 1973, these three individuals, Berg, Boyer, and Cohen, were the first to splice a gene from one species into another. So that's about 20, 30 years later, 20, 25 years later. Genentech was started a couple of years later, and we were able to make insulin, and lo and behold, the rush was on. But it was a very, very slow event. And in fact, the human genome was sequenced in about the year 2000. It was an announced sequencing. It actually wasn't sequenced. They just wanted to announce it when the race was over. And in 2010, we had this cover of Economist where Ham Smith, Craig Venter, and Clive Hutchinson had made life, although there's some controversy about the term of creating life, using 4 nucleotides, a bottle of G, a bottle of A, a bottle of T, and a bottle of C. The 4 nucleotides in a bottle with a machine was used to create, from a computer link of GATCs, a living organism that could reproduce. It was a version of a mycoplasma. So over the course of 40 years, we've actually come quite a ways. Does this impact your everyday life? So the point is that we've seen this, there's a lot of hype was around this. The Pope weighed in about it, President Obama weighed in, but it really hasn't done much for us. Where are we today? And as we look out in our brains, where are we going to be in a few years? If we look at the cycle of biotechnology hype, and there will be some disagreements about where I've put things here, I would say we're really at the transistor radio stage in the equivalent of the IT revolution. We've really mimicked nature a little bit. What you see is insulin is something we're making. We make biologic drugs, fertility treatments. These are all standard fare. These were shocking in the 1970s as concepts. Genomics, a number of things. Immuno-oncology, a very hot field. I know a lot about that, but I'm not going to talk about that today. That's a very, very exciting thing. Genetically modified organisms, they're here to stay, but we'll talk about that a little bit. Gene therapy, you can see all of these things. Every one of them has been through a hype point in their history. The current hype is gene editing, CRISPR, Cas9. We're going to go in and we're going to modify every gene in every species that exists in the environment, in ourselves, and everywhere else. I know the companies and all the investigators very, very well. I've never made an investment there because I advise a lot of investors, because the likelihood it's going to change something in the human's condition in the next 5 years is very limited. And the anti-aging movement is actually picking up some steam. The science is actually getting very good there. I track it every day. And so that's early stages. Don't be surprised when people start saying there's a generation that will not age. It's not us. And there's a generation that will not die. It's not us either. But our grandkids have some shot at not aging. But I'm not going to talk about that as well. But what I will say is, from an economic perspective, because I do go to economic conferences as well, we can very easily argue the biotech revolution in all of its formats, including its IT, et cetera, is impacting all aspects of our economy. And this will be growing and very, very meaningful as the technologies become more powerful, as they become cheaper, and as they become more ubiquitous. And if Exxon, for example, is putting hundreds of millions into algae farms to create energy from renewable resources, from CO2 and the sunlight. Whether you like Exxon or not, the science is great. So where are we in the brain technology revolution? I would say we're in the very earliest days. We've heard wonderful talks over the last few days about great technologies. But by and large, the human brain is something we cannot interrogate easily. We can't in the context of health and wellness. We have very primitive tools for actually seeing the functions of the brain, for diagnosing things, for modifying and changing things. What I've shown here is an MRI, a PET scan, EEG, and then some neuromodulation or neurostim, deep brain stimulation. And these are very effective tools, but their impacts on most people, they're very expensive. Their utility is not as clear in terms of understanding function, modifying function, and improving the welfare of sick people in ways that I think will truly be revolutionary. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you on a little tour of some of the people that I work with in the world at large in helping to bring their technologies forward. Oh, one quick comment about the brain. These technologies have been, like we've been hearing in the talks here, instrumental in finding where the different functions within the brain are and how they're cross-connected. But often the number of individuals being examined is limited. If we actually look to see where we are in the cycle of brain technologies, what I would say is there's a number of things coming. We just heard about biofeedback. I forgot to mention active monitoring of our health. But it's a little different than the biotech. It's actually behind it. The idea of using gene therapy, stem cells, because the brain has a blood-brain barrier, it's not as easy to do surgery on. Our understanding of how to intervene is behind other organs in the body. We're actually running behind that, and so actually you can look to other fields to see what's coming. And so what I'm going to talk about now with a quick tour is some of these technologies that I have worked with people on, either directly in terms of knowing their research or in terms of helping them start companies. And some of the business models, which you've heard about, which are a bit of a challenge. I'll start first with Jed Brewer, who is at the Center for Mindfulness at UMass, started by John Kabat-Zinn a few years ago, where I've actually participated in his mindfulness course, and he's actually, as we heard from Pattie, working on ways to break the cycle of bad behavior, whether it's drug addiction, stress, smoking, weight loss, and things like that. And how is this going to end? As I've said, I'm interested in how the real world is impacted. It's all going to be transmitted through your phone or AR or some other device. And he's actually shown, and this is real data, that you can reduce the anxiety that individuals who have very anxiety-driven lives with simple interventions through a cell phone. There are responders and non-responders, all the things you see. So the science is extremely good. The problem is there is no business model. Pattie already mentioned that. Health and wellness, preventing disease, insurance companies don't pay for that. And so the idea that you actually develop this device and then nobody's willing to pay for it, consumers are used to free or $1 a month. I work with a company called WellDoc, which I'm an investor in, where they actually have an FDA-approved, reimbursable, insurance reimbursable approach, an app to help diabetics get their glucose levels and monitoring down. It works, but insurance companies are reluctant, or doctors don't want to write prescriptions because they don't really believe that this patient on their own can actually have a lower glucose. And there's no intervention involved that a doctor's involved in. It's going to take another 10 years, and we really need to move to outcomes-based medicine before wellness will have any impact. So all I would say to this audience is buy these things. The thing that makes me most upset is when I see knockoffs of this. Any of these companies will do great science. This is spectacular science by real scientists. A knockoff will make an app that's almost free or $2, which is less than the copay the patient has to pay. And that's the one that gets used, but it's not as effective because it doesn't have the embedded science in it. I've actually participated in some of judged experiments. Here I am learning how to be happy. It's a nice biofeedback system. Actually, he had a great feedback system getting an MRI to learn to see if he could meditate. I'm not an A student in the meditation class, but I will say that when using biofeedback with this thing on my head, I actually could get into a mental state that was impossible for me to reach without the biofeedback systems. If we could reduce this to an at-home system, it'd be wonderful. We're not there yet. And what would I pay for it? I want my insurance company to get me off the stress. So the model has to be fixed. How about our DNA? This is something that we all have. It's something we're relatively ignorant of. I've actually got in my pocket my DNA sequence, my entire human genome. How many people here have had their DNA genome sequenced? Well, that's pretty good. We got a handful. And I can you will all agree with me, we as humans are all mutants. 100% of us are mutants. And what's the question is, what is it that's mutated? Well, there's a reference genome, so you actually get a few hundred mutations. And my friend who's a doctor who had to sign off for me to get this started laughing hysterically when I showed him my sequence, because I had every disease known to mankind on the list, because every gene has a name that is a name of a disease, because that's how you get an NIH grant. So, and he just started saying, no, you don't have all of these things. And actually, I'm getting my genome done again right now, an exome sequencing by a company called Helix that I have no affiliation with, which is only $100 for an entire exome sequencing, and so which you can download and do some fun things with. But this is only part of the story. Our DNA does not mutate in a generation or in a week. As we modify our brains, it's something we're going to be able to play with. But the more important stories are the rest of our genomes, the epigenome, the on and off switches. When somebody is born to a mother who actually had a very limited amount of food, like the Second World War babies coming out of Holland during some of the problems there, their genomes were changed with on and off switches. We do not have a method today to measure epigenome on a broad basis or interpret it. Your microbiome, the bugs in your body, those are actually playing a role. And some of the science of mechanistically driven compounds made by the bugs in your gut that they eat. They make serotonin, they make a lot of things. They make butyrate, things that actually modify your brain and your metabolism. Those papers are just coming together. In your virome, the first step of actually analyzing the microbiome of your gut is to throw away 10 to 50% of the DNA sequence, because it's viruses and we can't understand it, so we ignore it like it doesn't exist. So we're infected with far more organisms than we ever imagined. And all 4 of these genomes come from our parents the day we're born. 3 of them change over the course of our lives. In fact, some people say your DNA changes. So there's quite a bit of change going on. And as we go through things that modify our diet, modify our brains, all of these are being flipped on and off in ways that are very meaningful. The epigenome, the genome we carry today is nothing like the genome Charles Darwin had in his body at the same time. We're changed, we're different. Let's look at inherited diseases and the technologies that are coming. There's lots of inherited diseases here. There's a great TED talk from a young man that I know named Seth Rotberg about getting diagnosed with Huntington's in his 20s with no symptoms. He's part of the generation that says, oh my God, I have a genetic disease, and how do I actually lead my life? It's something that our generation, at least my generation, never had to think about. It was a mystery whether you were going to get Huntington's or not, even though your parent might have it. But where is this leading us? Human gene therapy. As I said, it's not really on our conscience right now. It was hyped in 1989 when you remember French Anderson and all of the committees and everything else. In the mid-90s, we actually had a tragic death of a young man named Jesse Gessinger. That dialogue, that narrative, fundamentally blocked any progress in the field for 20 years in terms of what was going on. The original worry of all gene therapy was going to cause tumors. Over 2,300 human trials in this country, we've never seen a single tumor. But it was only last year that the first gene therapy was approved. We've been able to diagnose sickle cell since the 50s. And we still don't have a gene therapy for it. I find this upsetting, but that's a different story. But the point is, it's coming. It's coming fast. The vectors are good. We understand what we're doing. The first 3 were approved last year. The first one in Europe, $1 million a patient because it's a cure. In the US, they're about $500,000 a patient right now. It would be great to see this come down to $5,000. Here I'm going to acknowledge a scientist, Dr. Chatterjee at the City of Hope. She's actually founded a company called Homology Medicines. They went public last week. I love their ticker symbol. It's called FIX, F-I-X-X. It's because she's going to be fixing the genomes of poor children who are born with inborn errors. What she's done is taken and this is not gene editing in the CRISPR context. She actually is using traditional homologous recombination with an AAV virus, which means that you can put in the left side, the top piece, the top blue hexagon, is a virus containing the gene which gets inserted, that is normal, which gets inserted into the human nucleus and repairs it under the control of the normal control mechanisms. So it's turned on and off by diet and all the things you normally would need to do. And what the company has shown in non-human primates with her technology is this vector can infect every single tissue in the body, and I've shown brain here, with a single IV injection. So now you can introduce a gene of your choice into a tissue. And in this slide, it simply shows that when introduced into the liver, 20% of the cells on a single injection are carrying this gene, which is now active in the liver because that's where this gene is normally present. And their first use is going to be in phenylketonuria. It's a gene that's expressed in liver, but it's a neurological disease, about 1 in 12,000 kids. And it creates very high levels of phenylalanine. Every kid is tested today at birth in this country for PKU. And you put kids on a very low phenylalanine diet. But a single injection, in this case it's a mouse model of PKU, takes the phenylalanine with the gene therapy down to normal levels, under normal regulation. So stay tuned. The idea of correcting our genes is coming in the disease area. And the idea of enhancement, as we've seen with AI, is right behind that as we go forward. Optogenetics. Most of you are familiar with this kind of field. I think it's nascent. I know Ed Boyden very well. Here's a panel of 6 people, more than the Nobel Prize Committee usually awards it to, so they're going to have a challenge for a while. But this is the idea of taking genes that are opsins. These are light-sensitive ion channels, or they can make G protein-coupled receptors, expressing them using gene therapy in the brain, and turn neurons into light-activated ion channel sensing systems. So you can turn a nerve on or off with light, or reverse it. You can actually read it. You can actually see an active or an inactive nerve cell, neuron. Here they're using a virus to do it, and here they're just simply showing that you use laser light to do that. Now, this is one of the hottest techniques out in the neurosciences field. Here it shows that a neuron expressing it, when a light is shined on it, the neuron is shut off. This is some amazing work, and we've seen that it's been used to erase memories, obviously implications for PTSD and other things like that. So this is not science fiction. This is in animals. It's even been in primates. But it's still quite nascent in terms of what its future is. Let's look at another modality in terms of imaging and the use of light. I'm now going to talk a little bit about some work related to how do we actually improve MRI. There's 2 ways for imaging right now, X-rays and magnetic resonance. The problem with MRI is it's extremely expensive. It's very, very slow, but it's safe. Infrared light actually can penetrate and go through the skull, but as you see from this hand, it's actually has 0 utility because of light scattering. You can never get a signal. Well, that's changing because of a friend named Mary Lou Jepson, and I am an investor in Open Water, a company she just founded. She's going to make a wearable MRI. You just heard about wearables? Imagine something that can be wearable to penetrate every tissue and get an image of it. She actually came out of the Media Lab, where Pattie is and her students, and she put the One Laptop Per Child project together with Nicholas Negroponte. And she shipped billions of dollars of computers around the world to some of the poorest kids in just, in developing world. And so she understands this. But her PhD thesis was in the field of optics. And she actually went on, and she was at Facebook for a while running the Oculus program, and it's a great system, the VR, but she just found it a trivial use in terms of gaming and just thought she wanted to do something bigger. Well, all of her years in the factories in Taiwan, she said $1 trillion has gone into creating the camera in her iPhones. That technology can now make holographic imaging possible in ways that had never been appreciated. And what she's going to show, she actually has a TED Talk next Friday where she's going to unveil a new device based on holographic imaging, which refocuses scattered infrared light that you shine into one side of the brain and comes out the other, so she can actually get three-dimensional imaging of the brain. She's not doing it on human brains yet. It's still in the prototype stage, but it's got hardware, LCDs, and all sorts of things. When we were doing diligence on her, we've known her for many years, we were doing diligence to see how things were going. She said, a physicist, Ted Hedge, said, it's theoretically possible to do what she does, but we don't believe she'll get it done. That was 12 months ago. It's now working. So stay tuned. We will all want one of these in our everyday lives. Her concept is you no longer need a colonoscopy in a center. You'll just wear a band around you, or you'll have something on your mind to read and write what's going on. And what's scary, here's some work that is pretty phenomenal from Dr. Jack Gallant's lab at UC Berkeley. We've heard talks like this week, where you see an individual in an MRI is watching the video on the left. The MRI, functional MRI analysis on the right is able to recapitulate from the visual cortex that image. Remember, MRI is slow. MRI has very poor resolution, whereas IR, infrared light, will have single neuron resolution, potentially, and video rates of seeing things. And so this kind of future where we could actually look inside the brain, monitor and measure, and maybe if we're throwing an opsin channel in there, modify our behaviors and our feelings will be different. So where are we? I have a couple of minutes here, but I'm going to throw things back in your lap a little bit. We have a lot of things we're putting in the stew. I know we don't know how they're going to come together, but they're at various stages. A lot of our extremely clever scientists are starting to cross-fertilize. The opsins are not yet sensitive to infrared. That's a good opportunity for someone who wants to find a way to actually merge these two things together. But we have a lot of new things ahead of us coming in terms of brain research and brain outcomes, hopefully first in helping with disease. So needless to say, humans are directly and deliberately taking control of life on this planet. It's inevitable because there's plenty of precedent, including our brains. And it's a well-worn path. I am first and foremost a cheerleader for finding ways to get disease under control and taken care of. I think we all are. But soon thereafter, we move to performance, aging, and beauty. Some of the biofeedback systems are being used by students to improve SAT scores, not by people with eating disorders and other things like that. And as we think about it, what will the rules be for modifying our brains? I had the fun pleasure of teaching a bioethics course last semester because it was kind of interesting. And we talked about a lot of concepts, and it was a very eclectic audience of students. It was international. What I learned is there's no simple rules about ethics. What is ethical for you may not be ethical for someone else. And so let's take a simple concept, like, do you own your body? Can I implant something in my own brain? Well, if you own your own body, you should be able to sell it, right? No one in this room in this country is allowed to sell any of these parts. But you know, there's only 49 countries that prohibit selling your red blood cells. And by the way, in the US, you can sell your hair, you can sell your sperm, you can sell your eggs, you can sell your poop, which was a surprise to me. Only $40, I don't know what you can sell your breast milk, and you can sell your platelets. So the same vein that took your red cells out can now take some of your white cells, and you can make money. So where's that ethical boundary that we are so sure we understand? And on top of that, you can sell your bone marrow if you live in the Ninth Circuit Court, which I think includes Arizona, because apparently one of the Supreme Court justices was very confident that it was okay to sell bone marrow out here and not on the East Coast. And finally, which is even more crazy, is you can actually rent a womb. You can buy sperm, you can buy eggs, you can rent a womb, but you cannot buy a baby. So I'm saying this facetiously to say, ethics are a very uncertain boundary. The things that were allowed 100 years ago are very different than the things we're allowed today. I mean, take suicide, used to be against the law. It's no longer against the law, depending on the country you live in. So as things get safe, we will do them. We will find ethical ways to permit it. We need to do it consciously. And one other interesting thing is, what is the cost that people will spare? Well, we actually know that. People will spend up to $35,000 for a gastric bypass, but really the cost is under $10,000. Anything goes. And you can see this from all the surgical procedures that 100 years ago, someone would be horrified to think anybody would do to themselves. We take it for granted. I'll end by pointing out that do not tamper with our kids. I'm fundamentally there right now. I think we do have some gene therapy stuff. We have a large conversation going on ahead of us. And these ethical challenges ahead are something I want to charge this audience with, educating your friends and family. You are the most knowledgeable, responsible people any of your friends know in this field. So to throw it back on the individual scientists is, you figure it out. No, this is something that we need to educate others about, what your opinions are. And so with that, I would say, you need to read, just like my granddaughter does. Any book that might enlighten you about how the growing future, the growing opportunities, and how our changing brains will evolve in the next generation and beyond. Thank you very much for your attention.
Just maybe one or two questions.
You began by mentioning the population explosion, and I just am wondering if you have any concern or input or opinion about overpopulation.
Overpopulation?
Yeah.
About overpopulation, I don't have any concerns personally. If you look at the actual statistics, every country that has women getting educated, the population falls below 2 births per person. And so it's a larger discussion. It includes, the Gates Foundation has been out ahead on this. If you want to read something about that, that's the place to go. Yeah.
Optogenetics, you mentioned, has a way to eliminate certain memories. Did I understand that correctly?
You did, because there's a way to put these channels into specific cell types in a specific neuron by putting a promoter on. You inject the whole animal, you put it in the entire animal, but it only shows up in certain cells. So when you shine a green light on, only those cells will respond in a way that gets activated. So there's ways to enhance memories, suppress memories, change movement behavior, all sorts of things that have been demonstrated in the literature.
So the memory is dependent on the activation of
that particular
and
cell type.
disactivation of certain cells.
Exactly. And suppressing memories has been the easiest thing they've done. Okay, suppressing fear, for example.
Yes.
Hi, great talk. I really enjoyed it. I just want to ask what you think or what your perspective is on non-invasive brain stimulation, and if that was the biofeedback you were talking about.
So I'm a big fan of non-invasive brain stimulation. I'm a big fan of a lot of things, as long as it's done responsibly. Its use in Parkinson's is unquestionable. I think you need an expert working on it, and we just need better ways to actually identify the right place and the right way to do it. It's not 100% useful. In other contexts, I think we're just in the earliest stages of diagnosis. We don't actually know how to use it the best. I would rather see more non-invasive things. We're seeing TMS, we're seeing electric stimulant, we're seeing other non-invasive approaches that need to play out over time. But the problem is these are complex diseases with different foci, and brain surgery is expensive, so we need something simpler.
Sorry, we're done. Thank you very much, Stephen. Let's give him a big round of applause.